So I'm just going to try and speak in general terms a bit about how UVW organises, or the approach we take towards organising, and then Susanna will speak a bit about, I guess, a more sort of personal, detailed, personal engagement of organising. And I'll speak more in general terms about what UVW does. I'm happy to answer any questions about UVW at the end, so I won't go into too much detail about our organisation, but yeah, we can answer any questions you might have. But basically, UVW represents low-paid and migrant workers by and large, and this is something which the union movement hasn't decided to do itself on the scale that it needs to do. There are pockets, examples, but they're not doing it on the scale that they need to, and so we have ultimately filled a gap basically in the union movement. At least that's how we like to see it. There's been a big gap, and all of our members, nearly all of our members, are low-paid and migrant workers. And then one of the questions which arises is that whether or not they have any power. So I just want to address this question quickly, because a lot of people call them unorganisable. And the basis behind that is the suggestion that they don't have any workplace power. And so somebody like Jay McAlevey, who many of you might know, I'm not sure, she's an organiser from the US who gives talks all over the world about her strategy, her model. And she would suggest that low-paid workers, service sector workers, don't have any workplace power, principally because they're replaceable during strikes and during disputes. And we would contest that, and what I'll talk about now, and what Susanna will talk about, is plenty of examples where low-paid precarious workers are expressing their workplace power, which may have a lot of support, community support and outside support. But nonetheless, I think it's a very unhelpful idea to suggest that low-paid service sector workers, many of whom are migrants, don't have the kind of power needed in order to take on their employers and in order to win. And that's what UVW has been doing and wants to continue to do. So it's not really, basically, I would say it's not about replaceability of power. There's lots of other factors which enter into disputes and into workplace struggles which will determine their outcomes, and that's not contingent on their replaceability. So I'd say low-paid migrant workers are as organisable as any other group of workers in the economy. They're not unorganisable, and they certainly can win. So moving on, I'm just going to go to my notes here. Right, some of the things which might be interesting is that we sort of organise through a network model. So we don't build branches in workplaces. We will if and when that situation arises, for example, in big workplaces like the LSE, where we've got our highest membership, and where we became the first union in the country to end outsourcing in a UK university, the LSE, and that was won through 7 days of strike action by cleaners, and then the largest cleaner strike in the history of the UK at the time, which has now been replaced by Unite. They organised a bigger strike at St Bart's Hospital. But anyway, yeah, that is one of the disputes there. So that's in the outsourced sector. And what I would say is that there's a sort of an idea that in the gig economy in particular, there's an idea about the new the disaggregation and disconnection of workers in the gig economy, which makes it very hard to organise. And it gives rise to a new model of organising. And I'll suggest that it's just the same in the service sector and the outsourced sector. There's nothing particularly unique, in my opinion, about much of the realities of working life in the so-called gig economy compared to the service sector and the outsourced sector. And that's more of an idea I'm throwing out there in terms of when discussing organising and strategies, how it varies and differs between sort of traditional sectors and the new gig economy sectors. In terms of the network I was going to mention, it's the workplaces of our members are really small in many cases, except for the LSE and other places like the Ministry of Justice, where we've just organised a big series of strikes which are ongoing, and you'll see a video of our last strike at the end. So really it's about organising in the low-paid precarious sector with migrant workers requires a lot of ideas and innovation in how to bring workers together. Their workplaces aren't the best places for them to meet and to talk. They don't have access. There's no access from outside unions in there. There's no recognition agreements. There's no facility time, and there's a lot of barriers towards workers sort of building branches in small workplaces. And so they need to come together in a network, and that's sort of the model which we follow. We didn't follow any sort of theory. That's sort of the reality of how we came to function. And so we have sort of big general meetings, for example, and we'll have sometimes hundreds of workers coming together from, sometimes hundreds of workplaces. And we'll just be, and that's a big part of what we do, is sort of building solidarity and activism between workplaces rather than in workplaces directly. And a lot of the struggles and disputes we end up fighting depend on that kind of solidarity and that sort of support given between workplaces and between workers. And I can answer questions about that. But just briefly on the branch model, it's very ineffective principally because of a lot of language barriers. A lot of our members don't speak English, and so it doesn't lend itself to the traditional sort of requirements of a branch. And there's also high turnover in a lot of the sectors, which makes it very hard for workers to sort of establish branches which can then stand the test of time and actually still function. And also the problem with the so-called branch model is that it really depends on a sort of the traditional form of sort of negotiation and engagement with management, which isn't very effective in a lot of the workplaces where our members work. Confrontation is required in all cases, or the threat of confrontation, and that doesn't depend on a sort of a structured branch model, and it doesn't depend on a recognition agreement really to do that. And so obviously branches normally end up trying to secure recognition agreements and then to negotiate, but that's never been done successfully or effectively in the low-paid labour market, in the low-paid economy. Okay. Activism, something that we have a large student base, and I think that in terms of the discussion around organising low-paid migrant workers, I think that the student body needs to be engaged a lot more, and we've seen a rise recently in the interest of students and universities in the labour movement, which I don't think there's been in the last decades in this country, and they're coming a lot to UVW and our sister union, the IWGB, and so we are thinking of, for example, launching a sort of an organising academy for students. We did a call out the other day, and we got sort of 30 students that were willing to represent, to organise, and to go and play a big part in the campaigns that we do. They've got a lot of energy, a lot of ideas. They've got a lot of contacts and connections, and so hopefully we'll see that. I think that could fundamentally shift sort of trade unionism, especially in the low-paid sector. But that's really exciting and interesting, I think, and that's something we might see in the coming months. That developing the idea that students can, one of the big unions don't really open their doors to support or voluntary sort of support and solidarity. It's very hard to sort of help big unions. They don't really want to receive any help from people that want to give it. Whereas we're very different. We'll take help from anyone, anytime. And that's just an interesting shift, and I think, and dynamic in these sectors and in organising low-paid workers. As the role of students. Recruitment very quickly. We don't recruit through information, by handing out information or leaflets. It's through action really. So it's sort of action rather than information. Some of our biggest sort of recruitment drives have come off the back of successful representations or successful strikes. So, for example, at the Ministry of Justice, the entire security force at the Ministry of Justice joined us after the cleaners went on strike. So they were securing the picket line, doing their job as security guards during the picket line of the cleaners at the Ministry of Justice. And then as soon as that strike finished, when they realised what the cleaners were asking for, which was the exact same thing that the security needed as well, which is a pay rise, they then joined us and they went on strike as well. So that sort of shows that, the idea that, there seems to be a belief, I think, in the union movement that, workers just need a bit of information and they just need to understand what unions are about. I don't think that's the case at all. I think people, workers, they need to see action and they need to be inspired by action. And I think that's the sort of the model we're pursuing. Workers will join once they see action. Lastly, strategy. We've seen it's very hard to continue. You can't obviously fight 1,000 disputes at once. And so what we're trying to do is coordinate as many strikes as possible. And this is a shift in our approach to disputes, and something I hope the union movement does at large as well, because obviously they've got the size and the resources to do it in a way we don't. But even with our limited size and resources, we've gone from organising single workplace disputes to we coordinated 3 strikes between different workplaces of our members last summer. That was at the Ministry of Justice, the Kensington and Chelsea Council, and the Hospital Corporation America, which had 9 sites in there. So actually, and the Ministry of Justice has 3 sites, and RBKC had 2 sites. So we're looking at a huge number, and so we coordinated ultimately 15 workplaces to all walk out and strike together. The RBKC strike won, following an occupation granted of a council meeting, which sort of forced the lead councillors to come out to the picket line and speak to the cleaners. But nonetheless, that I think is a really important thing that the union movement needs to do, and that's what UVW is trying to do, is to coordinate as many strikes as possible. And so we coordinate amongst ourselves, and then we're always looking for ways to escalate. When you're organising and fighting, you need to think of ways to escalate. And so we went from coordinating strikes amongst ourselves to coordinating strikes between ourselves and another union. And that was PCS Union. And so they got inspired by the strikes of the Ministry of Justice. And then they organised their branch and of outsourced workers, caterers, security, cleaners, porters. And they went on strike. And so we coordinated a 2-day strike together. We then, thinking of another way to escalate, we have to grow always. And this is sort of what hopefully the union movement will focus on and try and do. So we then coordinated another strike with a third union, which is IWGB. And so on the 22nd of February, on the March Against Outsourcing that was mentioned in at the beginning, that was actually also a 3-way coordinated strike between University of London, Ministry of Justice, and the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. And that was the first time, as far as I'm concerned, that had happened. And they were quite significant institutions. And so if that can continue, and if that can grow in that way, then we could see a massive shift, I think, in the successful unions and in low-paid workers in particular, in their fight to continue to win some of the things they've won. Yeah, and just to say, like, the victories are coming. So we've had, the LSE I mentioned, the Ministry of Justice, the cleaners won a 15% pay rise there on the back of their strikes. RBKC, they won the entire living wage, just a 30% pay rise, so that's really, really significant. And there's countless other examples. Harrods, actually, 2 years ago, the chefs and waiters threatened to walk out on strike, and they got £5,000 a year extra pay rise given, because basically the tips used to be taken by management and given to the Qatari royal family owns Harrods. And so basically the tips of the chefs and waiters in Harrods were given to the Qatari royal family. And anyway, they threatened to walk out on strike over that, and they won that, and that was £2.5 million that they won collectively. That was the amount of the tips that used to be shipped off overseas. And anyway, I guess that's just a big example. So the LSE contract was worth £5 million, and that was terminated early with the cleaners being brought in-house, and that was 300 workers. And all of these campaigns and disputes have been won without really no resources at all. There's been no investment in the campaigns. We don't have any money to invest in these disputes. And so they're very much focused on direct action, on collective action, and on solidarity. And those are really the only strengths that we have, is this network of activists, this network of workers, and sort of a real determination to fight and win. And hopefully that these things, we think they are scalable, we think they are replicable. We don't think there's anything particularly unique about what UVW, how UVW does it. So we hope that what we do will inspire other bigger unions, to be honest, to get off their asses and do what needs to be done. And yeah, that's it. Yeah.